afternoon, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the panel, To Play or Not to Play. My name is Natalia Kuraeva. I'm Senior Instructor Designer at the TLT, and I will be your moderator for this session. Walker is our technical moderator. Please use comments to share your ideas and ask questions. Panelists will address all questions at the end of the discussion.
And Natalia, sorry to interrupt, but if somebody has Hopin open in the background, if you'd be so kind as to close that window, because we're getting an
terrible echo, and I wasn't sure what's going on. Thank you, Walker.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll continue now. Among our panelists, we have game designers, researchers, and educators. So first, I would like our panelists to introduce themselves, please. We can start with David.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Chernoff, and welcome to our session on game. Oh, am I off mute?
You're good.
I am. Okay. Welcome to our session on gamification, game-based learning. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to dive right in and start us off with some basic definitions before telling you a little bit more about my take and experience with educational gaming. First, I should know, if you looked up or Googled definitions of gamification and game-based learning, you might get identical definitions of each. And that's part of the problem we're trying to address here. A lot of people think of these terms synonymously while others distinguish among them. So we created this panel in part to provide us with different perspectives on how some people who have been involved with games and education think about these different practices and how we approach them. As I was wrestling with providing a succinct definition examples that distinguish between gamification and game-based learning, I came across a website that did so really perfectly. So I figured I would share that with you now.
David, can I interrupt you just for 1 second? Yeah. Let's just for 1 minute. Let's other panelists introduce themselves, and then we jump to the questions. It's okay. We're all good. We're all good. Now, Dr. Karen Kat, would you please tell us a couple of things about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel. So great to have you here. I am the director of games at Marist College and also an associate professor of games and emerging media there. I'm also currently consulting as a lead game designer for the World Health Organization. And I've had 20 years of game design experience prior to becoming a full-time academic. I worked at places like Nickelodeon and Scholastic. I'm also currently advising for a number of educational games, including Mission US and Quandary. And I am excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. We have Rick Anderson. Please, Rick.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Yep. I'm Rick Anderson. Director of Virtual Worlds and Director of Game Research and Immersive Design here at Rutgers as part of TLT. So my team builds out immersive experiences. We do a lot of game-based learning. We consult. We help people get grants for their bigger projects. So we really enjoy being a service to the university as a way to create games and get them into the classroom or get them online. A little bit of the history is that we were the first group at Rutgers to build out virtual worlds. So we did all the Second Life, the OpenSim, and sort of like old is new again. So the world is being kind of refreshed in that way. But I'm also building out things like the physical spaces through the maker spaces, and then having been virtual for the last couple of years, I've been starting to look into reinforcement learning for machine learning crossed with online education and games. So I've been doing quite a number of things, and I would say our latest game sequence has been for violent victim protection and victim assistance for situations of violence. And those games just got released, and they're basically an in your shoes and experience where you're trying to be on the journey of somebody, and those become the starting points of conversation in the workshops to help talk about difficult situations that people have found themselves in. So anyway, we try to get into the emotion. So oftentimes immersion for me is about that emotion in games. So I'll leave it at there, and we'll hear more to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. And we have Behesti. Behesti, please.
Yeah. My name is Beheshte Abdi, or Behi Abdi. Um, I'm an instructional designer at teaching and learning with technologies at Rutgers University, and also I'm a PhD candidate in instructional technology. I have some research experiences using gamification in education, and um, I'm actually in the process of finalizing an article about systematic literature review of impact of gamification in educational settings.
Excellent, Becky. Thank you so much. Well, as you see, we have an excellent panel and a lot of expertise right here. So very briefly, I'm just going to go over our goals for this session. So basically, we're going to just have a great conversation about the games. We will discuss the differences between the types of games in education. We will determine the positive and negative effects of integrating gaming in education. We will also discuss and determine the impact of integrating gaming in different educational modalities such as online, hybrid, or face-to-face. And finally, we will identify the characteristic of a well-designed gaming strategy and education. So let's begin. I am going to start with David, please. And our question is just like that. We often hear these two terms, gamification and game-based learning. Can you please briefly explain what these terms mean? And please tell us a little bit about your experience as it relates to these terms. I know you started a little bit, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but now we are ready for your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think we got our wires crossed. I thought you wanted the definitions first, but I think the brief introductions made perfect sense. So yeah, I came across this website that I think really reflected our views as we talked about the distinction between gamification and game-based learning. So I wanted to share that with you all. So in this definition, basically, gamification is the application or integration of game elements. So application or integration of game elements, that's really the main part. Like point systems, leaderboards, badges, and other elements related to games into conventional learning activities or like non-game activities in order to increase engagement and motivation. So for example, an online discussion forum in a physics course might be gamified via a badge system. So a student might be awarded a Ptolemy badge after they've made 10 postings, a Galileo badge after 20 postings, a Kepler badge after 30 postings, and an Einstein badge after 40, and so on. So in the ideal game environment or gamified environment, students can see the online badges that peers have earned to create a sense of camaraderie or competition. And I might add that people can get rewards or inducements like points and badges for any number of things. It could be performance on some task meeting academic objective, like points for supporting writing, assignment that with evidence. The more evidence you produce, the more points. And if the assignments, if there's many assignments, the score would be cumulative, and there might be a leaderboard and so forth. So, or it might just be for following the rules or procedures of a teacher that the teacher made. In game-based learning, in contrast, involves designing learning activities so the game characteristics and game principles inhere within the activities themselves. So for example, in an economics course, students might compete in a virtual stock trading competition, or in a political science course, students might role play as they engage in mock negotiations involving a labor dispute. So in short, gamification applies game elements or game framework into being applied to existing learning activities that are not games. And then game-based learning designs learning activities that are game-like, or you are playing games as learning activities. As we talked a little bit, there was the sense that we wanted to unpack a few other terms. I heard, in the chat, some people said, talk about serious games. That's a really easy definition. That's just a game designed for a primary purpose other than pure entertainment. So in an educational context, that's presumably the purpose is educational. An educational video game, very similar. It's a video game that provides learning or training. Okay, so by definition, that's a serious game, but it's a video game. So yeah, I'm happy to tell you just a little bit about my experience in relation to gamification and game-based learning. Briefly, I identify mainly as a researcher and mainly in the realm of educational psychology. And my particular area of interest, research interest, is in student engagement and motivation. So for probably 10 years before I became a professor, and I've been a professor about 10, 20 years now, I became pretty well steeped in the literature on motivation to learn, and particularly interested in an area of motivational research called intrinsic motivation. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. There's plenty of literature that does give me some concerns about gamification in general that I can share. More recently, since about, I don't know, 2006, one of my primary focuses has in research activities has been with educational video games. So more specifically, I teamed up with an engineering professor who created educational video games, and I was the educational psychologist who brought in experiences and measures of learning, student engagement and learning into the game. So I come at this primarily as a researcher and also as an educational psychologist who's collaborated closely with a game developer in his content area of mechanical engineering. And that research provided results and findings about the unique advantages of educational video games, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit later.
Thank you so much, Dave. If Kat, Becky, or Rick would like to add something about your own experience with gaming, please. This is a great time to do that. Rick,
So
let's
Oh.
start with you.
I always try to let Kat go, but
Okay.
I can go. That's fine. I didn't want to take up from. It's hard to know when to speak.
I know. But look, everybody's flexible here. So
Yeah.
Kat, why don't you start?
Sure. So it's a great point in that, there are differences between gamification and game-based learning. Sometimes they even overlap a little bit, where the difference between them gets a little fuzzy, right? So you might have a game that has leaderboards or badges in it as part of the game. But like for me, I will be honest and say that as a game designer, we cringe a little bit when we hear the term gamification, because what we want to build are games, and we want to build transformational games, right? We want people to feel not just that they're, trying to go to like the next badge or trying to be the top of the leaderboard. Oftentimes, sometimes that works, right? Sometimes, having badging and leaderboards works. And sometimes it actually could be demotivating, right? So you could feel like, oh, I'm at the bottom of the leaderboard. I'm never going to be able to get up there, forget it. I'm not even going to try. And then you just kind of
Give up.
tune out. And one of the things I always say is that, if you're using leaderboards, it's almost like you're saying you don't want women to play your game, because women are particularly demotivated by leaderboards. And, that's just based on some research on that. But so just to tell you a little bit about the kinds of games that I make, I'm really interested in transforming doctors and nurses and other medical professionals and helping them get the training that they need to be able to support others, right? So for example, in Ukraine, being able to handle traumatic mass casualties that are coming in, right? So we are creating a game, for example, called M-Care. That's sort of like the name right now. And it's an augmented reality game where you play with your fellow colleagues at a hospital. And in front of you is this virtual hospital that looks exactly like your hospital, right? And so you are working around a table in person, but all of you are seeing the same virtual hospital in front of you. And the mass casualties are coming in. Maybe it's from a bombing, maybe it's from an earthquake, maybe unfortunately all of these are horrible events, right? You never want these to happen, but you need to practice right before it happens, so that when or if it does happen, you're prepared as a hospital to support those casualties and those who are injured coming in, and you're trying to save as many lives and you're trying to heal as many people as possible. So we have a game that we're designing now to simulate that situation where these virtual patients are coming in. You might be working as a doctor, you might be working as an incident commander, You might be the person right at the front who's triaging the patients, putting them into different zones. And you are working together as a team with different roles, trying to heal as many people as possible coming in. And so we're trying to help people train for those unfortunate incidents that hopefully never will happen, but at least you'll be prepared for that kind of event. And games don't need to be digital even. You can use a board game, you can use a card game, you can use an in-person interactive game to share some kind of experience, right? I've created this very short in-person game where you're just trading pieces of paper and you're lining up, and through that action of doing different kinds of trades depending on the rules, you actually learn about different kinds of values and different kinds of value systems. So it doesn't have to be, fancy game. The MCare game, the augmented reality game, actually, we also have a non-digital version where it's just pen and paper. You're using tokens as, instead of patients coming in, you're using a drawn map of your hospital, and you're again working around the table. And that can be really, really effective as well. And so I'm super excited to be here to talk about some benefits and also the challenges with using games to support learning.
Thank you so much, Kat. And you're not alone with that. We have comments that people also feel gamification makes them sad because there's so much extrinsic motivation reinforce systematic barriers in learning. We're going to move on to Rick and Bertie. Tell us very briefly about your experience and how you relate to these two terms.
Yeah, so briefly, in my case, what I've been trying to build these emotional experiences and try to work on empathy as like a key part of immersion and trying to get people into a situation. So one of the examples is in the social work space. We had a game that we built for a workshop where you were trying to build trust with somebody and you're trying to ask if they were involved in sex trafficking. And essentially the game was set up with increasing trust and decreasing trust from a point of view of you interviewing somebody, and their emotions were fed back to you as you did the game. And what we ended up doing was, instead of a point system, we did a visual system of you spelling out the word trust. And, so we have all kinds of different ways of expressing that. And I would say the gamification portion is sort of challenging when you get into the classroom space. And I'll let Bihi cover that part.
Yeah, actually, I don't have, honestly, practical experience with using gamification or game-based learning in the classroom, but my experience is actually reviewing literature review and systematic literature review of using game in the research. I have reviewed, I can say, more than 150 articles about advantages of gamification and game-based learning in education. And as I said, I'm in the process of finalizing an article about that. But I would like to talk about advantages of gamification later.
Yes.
It's right.
Becky, this is perfect transition, because our next question is exactly that. What are the pros and cons of gamification in higher education? Why don't you continue and tell us about the advantages?
Yeah, actually, first of all, I just want to mention that gamification is not always the right solution to each complex and advanced concept, because gamification is not appropriate strategy for all types of education and training, and it's best suited for the content that can be memorized or doesn't require major behavior shift. Because the gamification is going to be used in training employees as well in many companies and corporations. So since the training content itself is not gamified, is not super engaging, so training content must be simple and easy to understand. So one of the advantages of the gamification is that it's very easy to implement and therefore has low cost versus game-based learning. and it's suitable for making repetitive or boring actions more fun for students, and can stimulate friendly competition in the classroom to improve student engagement. And but one of the challenges is that gamification is less effective in the long run. But I can say that research over the years found that gamification does bring benefits when properly used. So using an action research design, some of the researchers has found that gamification can have a positive effect on student knowledge and retention, depending on their age and gender. When I say gender, I should mention that most of the female students actually like social mechanism because it provides more interaction and group activities with the other students. I have some actually background on social skills of children, but I can connect my research on gender differences on between students in terms of their interest in gaming education and gamification. I would say that mostly female students are more interested in social activities than male students, and they have more social actually skills, better, higher scores in social skills. So research shows that positive effects of gamification on enhancing interaction with learning materials and performance on studies have been actually reported by researchers, and both I can say that systematic reviews have revealed both positive and negative effects. For example, some of the researchers have found that use of game design elements such as badges, points, and trophies, and leaderboards and avatars not only promote students' extrinsic motivation, but also they increase their intrinsic value for learning. However, they also report studies with contradictory finding. I know that Dave has some points, criticizing gamification that I know that he believes that using game elements will decrease intrinsic motivation. But I would say that based on my review, some of the research shows that if the instructional designers or instructor design the course materials and use the game mechanics properly, we can increase the student intrinsic motivation. The other benefits of gamification is that it's not limited in the classroom, that we can use it in learning outside the classroom. Perhaps the instructor can break up the students' math, for example, math homework into sections, and the learners can then level up after completing each section to get hints.
That's very interesting, Becky. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to David and Rick. Can you tell us a little bit more about the disadvantages? Becky mentioned that you have some points, David. Let's start with you.
Oh, yeah. I'm also going to draw on the research and more on the psychological research. And as Becky alluded, exactly on this point of intrinsic motivation, it basically goes to the effect of rewards. Especially for learning, okay? So, now right off the bat, advocates of gamification might point out that it is a lot, more than it's about a lot more than just rewards. And that may be a valid point, but these concerns are basically limited to the effect of rewards based on a whole lot of research. So you might say, what's wrong with rewards? Certainly in the tradition of psychology and behaviorism, Skinner demonstrated, for example, that through, rewards through various systems of positive and negative reinforcement could be extremely powerful in affecting, and shaping behavior. At SeaWorld, for example, right? You see, the little fish are really powerful rewards for the dolphins to do their jumps and entertain the crowd. And gamification also reminds me an awful lot of classrooms for children with special needs, like with behavioral challenges, because there's all sorts of point systems and token economies of both punishments and rewards tied to like as inducements for desirable behaviors, more in the name of behavioral management in that context. But I'm very familiar with that, having worked in those environments for several years. So through the 70s and 80s, there was a bunch of research that began to proliferate on this intrinsic motivation, which is just doing an activity for its own sake, just because you want to. And intrinsic motivation can be seen as a hugely important variable for like, discovery, invention. All you have to do is look at like, what motivated people like Einstein and the Darwins of the world to see how, it's an important force for, but at any rate, the research on intrinsic motivation exposed sort of a crack in the benefits of rewards. It wasn't that they couldn't shape behavior, but it was sort of like at what cost. And it exposed a lot of different costs for learning, things like continuing motivation, conceptual learning itself, creativity. So I'll just give you like a couple examples of like these kinds of studies. So there was one researcher named Teresa Mabule in her dissertation on creativity. She had two groups of people basically make drawings, and one was then judged by a panel of judges. That created an extrinsic motivation. It was like an extrinsic constraint. The other drew just because they wanted to. And then actually the drawings of both groups were judged, and it was the intrinsic motivation group, their drawings were judged to be much more creative. So that extrinsic constraint reduced the intrinsic motivation. There were other studies like on continuing motivation, like two groups playing pinball machines. One group just because they wanted to, one for reward, and they'd play, and then the experiment would be over. But actually, that's when the real experiment would just start. There was like hidden cameras that would see which group would keep playing the video game when left to their own devices. And it was the intrinsic motivated group that were playing just because they wanted to, that would continue to play the game even though they didn't have to. So that was an example of continuing motivation. Other studies looked at like, solving puzzles and the effect on actual conceptual learning. And again, showing that extrinsic motivation could undermine some of these processes having to do with learning themselves. But he's right. Like there's other theories, like I work with a theory called flow, which I can tell you a little bit more about, and it's sort of intense concentration. And in flow, people tend to get in flow more from like competition. So the effect of competition and like peak performance can be high. So it's not that I can't see any of the advantages, but I thought I would point out that concern about the rewards.
I guess there's time and place for either approach. I'm going to turn to Rick and ask him to now refocus a little bit and talk to us about game-based learning instead of gamification. Tell us about what the advantages or disadvantages of game-based learning now.
Well, I would actually. So I'll talk about that, and I also want to talk a little bit about what I've learned from the panel. And I think one of the ways to think about this is, what is your game system? Finding the game. So if you're teaching a course, are you finding the game or the games in that course? And I think that's a pretty interesting thing, because it's a question for both people who are trying to have the ability to gamify a course and the people who can create like complete experiences. Like that question, finding the game, is in both places. And so I want to say, like, if you think about your learning management system as a game platform, right? You're building your game in the LMS, or you're building the game in the tools that you have. It starts building onto the idea that any game that you create has a set of rules, and those set of rules can be exploited, or they can be followed. You can be in the game, you can be out of the game. And so one of the things that's developed as a common phrase in a lot of the online games or multiplayer games is the meta, where you've got a really well-balanced game, and then you change one thing, you add an item, you add a weapon, or you do a thing, or you change the economy. And suddenly there's what you would sort of see as an exploit. People are taking advantage of the point system, or they're taking advantage of this new, thing that they can do. And so I would just say that the idea of this meta is really interesting, because the meta in gamification is the syllabus plus the administration and all of the things that you can do as combined with the tool. So I think that kind of is both where I think there's an advantage and a disadvantage. So you've got exploits happening in real life for courses, and you have like your meta that could be broken down or balanced in that space. When I'm building a game in the game-based learning, what I'm doing is I'm looking for what is our objective, what's our learning objective, and then I'm like saying, what's the shape of this concept? How do we build a scenario with people or emotions that get to the heart of the problem that you're trying to solve, or not solve as much as create the experience that you need somebody to have. So when I do game-based learning projects, we try to break them into those components. So again, I've talked about the social work stuff. I've talked a little bit about the sort of workshop spaces, but we also have the ability in our classes to like have students create games. So you can actually have the meta experience of students building games and social games using a technology. So they're actually building the game and prototyping it in some of the classes I do. So it's a really exciting experience to just not have the faculty or the instructor or the administration mission outline the rules of the game, but the students can outline the rules of the game. You can, as a faculty person, choose what game experience you want to share. I think these things in the game-based learning space are really nice advantages because you're creating sort of a complete experience. You don't have to sort of say, my tools only let me do this, but oftentimes your tools only let you do a certain number of things anyway. So I just wanted to point out this idea of meta affects both. And if you have good practices, you can build those experiences as best you can, but the meta is always there. There's always something that's going to mess with the situation and people will try to take advantage of it. And so anyway, game balance is one of the key things. And in a game that's more game-based, you can work on the balance. And whereas a semester-long course with gamification is the next time you can rebalance is next semester. Mm-hmm. So I'll just sort of leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Rick. I love that you incorporating students to build games. It's like active learning, so valuable. I know these topics are so great. We can talk like maybe another half a day or maybe the whole day, but we don't have that time here. So we're going to move on to our next question. And since we learned already a lot about gamification and game-based learning, I wanted to turn to Kat for a minute because I know that she is involved in making games more inclusive. I would love to hear a little bit about that, and then we maybe define what a well-built game is. So, Kat, could you please talk about inclusivity in games?
Yes. So I am super interested in making games and the gaming community a more inclusive space. And one of the things that I have been working on with a bunch of other people is to create a new inclusive games network where we can support games that are trying to be more inclusive. And inclusive could mean a lot of different things, right? Ensuring that it's accessible to all different types of bodies, ensuring that everybody feels like they belong, whether it's based on gender identity or sexual identity or race or ethnicity, religion, any of those identity factors. We want to make games much more representative of the entire human community and to be more inclusive of that. And to that end, I've been working on specifically doing research in that area, right? So I've been researching games and the intersection of bias and how we might use games to reduce biases. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now is for a Templeton grant, and I'm working with colleagues at the Lagos Business School in Nigeria, and we're creating a VR game to support empathy and compassion for other ethnicities in Nigeria. So the game is, sorry about that. The game is targeted toward Nigerian youth. It is looking at, there's over 250 different ethnic groups in Nigeria. So we've kind of narrowed it down to 4. And so you're playing as someone from one of those 4 ethnic groups, and it's going to be an ethnic group that's not your own. So for example, if you are Yoruba, you might play as someone who's Hausa, and you would be in this VR experience embodying them and feeling what they're feeling, hopefully, and understanding what they're going through and facing different kinds of bias and discrimination. And the hope is that you will start to expand your mind and to understand what other people go through, and perhaps reduce your biases about them. Now, of course, you can never fully understand what someone else is going through. You're really just getting a taste of that experience. But we're hoping that just having that experience starts to expand minds. We're also looking at another research study we're doing is related to game jams. And game jams are these really condensed, intense, 24-hour to 48-hour game creation events. And we're looking at whether making a game, so actually the process of designing a game, can that also reduce biases and enhance compassion? And so we're trying to figure out exactly what the design principles are and what the kinds of activities are that might make the gaming community a more inclusive space.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, especially games that will help people develop empathy. Everyone, our society really needs that, especially now. Well, that was great. Great that you shared that experience with us, Kate. I would like, we have just a few minutes left, about maybe 13 minutes. If we have, I want to remind our attendees, if you have any questions to panelists, please put them in comments and we will do our best to address them. But meanwhile, we're going to turn to another question, and I'm going to ask, David to start us, and Rick and Becky to help us out. So please, let's talk about how do you approach the game design, and what is really good, well-designed game is. What characteristics that type of game would have? Rick, we're going to start with you, and oh, I'm sorry, I said David. David, we're going to start with you, and then anybody else.
Yeah, so thanks. Well, I guess as a rejoinder to Rick and Kat, I mean, it's incredible some of these games and what they do. I mean, like Kat's example of the game in Ukraine. I mean, number one, it's showing, it's really simulating the actual experience, and what that does is it helps people learn like a complexity of thinking that is really hard to get in other ways. So like right now, there's a lot of concern about crisis. We're facing one crisis after another. We had COVID, now we have Ukraine. And so is it possible that video games can help prepare people to develop that kind of complexity of thinking so that they're better prepared for future crisis? And that has to do with, creating these really authentic tasks that are tied to the learning goals. And then, the work that Rick did on empathy and the inclusivity work, that also just, getting into that realm of not just learning mentally, but like an emotional form of learning that I think you don't get in other ways. But that it is a unique advantage that you're not seeing elsewhere. But my experience comes again as a researcher. In our studies, we looked at we compared students who took an undergraduate mechanical engineering classes in a traditional way with lots of labs and homeworks and texts to later years where the whole course was revamped around teaching it with an educational video game. And why did we use an educational video game? Mainly because when you're playing a game, students can be, it deeply engages students into a learning experience. When people playing games are said to like plunge into it, they're fully immersed, and you get into a state that's sometimes called flow, which is intense concentration and absorption. So basically, in our research, it was this video game. They raced a car around a track, and they made programs to do different kinds of challenges. And the findings showed that students were much more deeply engaged. They had more intrinsic motivation, which we talked about before, but also that they were engaged in more deep learning. So that when they took tests of the course material, the students who played with a video game demonstrated that they did a lot better on the tests and more deep learning in the conceptual learning of the course principles. So I guess that goes back to some of the unique advantages. But as far as the design aspects, I think it relates to this idea of really authentic tasks that very strongly to the learning goals, to teach, as an ideal way to teach something specific, which I think Rick mentioned. And then also just the forms of feedback that you get in real time, where the games often have meters. I've seen a game with the flowometer, for example, where you get that feedback, and the challenges are increasing. So usually the game starts at a simple level, and then the player builds the skills, and then as you build the skills, you go to the next level. So I think that's another really important game design feature that increases learning.
Thank you so much, David. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to switch it up just a little. We do have a question, but before we go there, I want to ask each of the panelists to use one sentence or short phrase to describe characteristic of a really well-designed game. I heard one important concept, that game has to be authentic. What else? We're going to go next to Rick.
All right. So for me, I'm very much about co-design and collaboration. So one of the things is having everybody on board with both the designers, the people, the faculty person, the material, having it on board. And I think I'd go back to the authentic goals. But also, a well-designed game is going to be tested, and it's going to be balanced, and it's going to be editable and changeable rather than just sort of one time fits all.
Perfect. Being flexible. Love it. Thank you, Rick. Kat, what about you?
Yeah, those are really great points. I think I love the idea of co-design. When I think of design, I think of it like for something else, right? So you're designing for. And so for me, it's about designing for an audience, for a need, for a context. Does it need to be a game? I don't know, right? So really kind of questioning that in that practice. I love the idea of also making sure that it's play tested. But I think most importantly is that it is inclusive and equitable and accessible so that anybody can play and everybody feels welcome and everybody feels like they belong.
Kat, you speak my language. Perfect. Behi, please, your thought of well-designed game.
Thank you. I just want to mention that gamification or even game-based learning impacts the student differently. For example, Zimmerman asserts that using extrinsic motivator in education, such as rewards, decreases the student intrinsic motivation, as Dave also mentioned. However, researchers, some of the researchers, including Zimmerman, add that students might respond differently to the extrinsic motivators due to their individual differences. Some of the gamification already, some of the researchers have found gamification very motivating and engaging. But something that is very important to turn it to effective is that instructional designers or game designers should include two important game elements, that is two important features of gamification, which are very related to motivation. One of them is setting clear goals, and the other one is immediate feedback. In gamified classroom, players learn the content in it. Also, providing some opportunities for the learners to learn in group atmosphere, in which there is a potential to create interest and engagement in a shared passion, to play through competing with other players are very important. I know that Dave has some great research about the impact of group work activities on student engagement, that he has his actually research result has found that group activities are very effective in improving student engagement. Also in gamification, if you implement game elements, we can include some game elements in form of group atmosphere in group activities. The last point that I want to mention is that in including some game elements, we should be very cautious and be very cautious that using badges to use less participatory badges and more skill badges. Also about using the leaderboards, it's very important to when you use leaderboards in the gamification to gamify the course, we should display only just a few top scores, and or maybe different knowledge in different knowledge domains, which allows more students to be recognized in the classroom. And also we shouldn't not to limit to external incentives, and using social mechanism also is very important. That as I mentioned is very interesting for female students, and can be added to provide more engaging students. And also another point is sending virtual gifts or extra lives to the other as a game elements to the other students as a social elements of game would be very important.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just because we're running out of these precious minutes,
Yes.
I do want to get to David just for a moment. And we also have a question. I think maybe Rick can address that. And Rick, I'm going to read the questions first. When is the term simulation used instead of game? While you're thinking hard about that, David, your one sentence or phrase about best well-designed characteristic of the game.
Yeah, I'll just throw one more out there, which is called need to know learning. You might have heard about this. So in the race car game, for example, in order to figure out like the optimal time to shift gears, students would have to engage in equations, and that would entail route finding. So like normally that would be like, drudgery, but games have a way of making you retrieve information and learn things in a way that's like timely and fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think fun is a great point for the games. We have to have some fun. Rick, please. Simulation versus game.
Yeah, so simulations are more of a recreation, or like in physics or chemistry, there's something that you're simulating. So as opposed to sort of being an analog to something or very similar to, you're teaching somebody how to be in a process or like it's the simulation is going to be about preciseness. And for instance, it might not have a score. It may be that you're an interactive simulation, but it's doing something, there's some kind of outcomes, there's some game elements to it, but simulation frequently is trying to get to the physics of it, get to the chemistry of it, or get to simulate the process. And then once you go simulate the process, you get back to game.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have just about 1 minute. I want to thank all of our panelists, and obviously they're so passionate. So I'm sorry we have only 50 minutes for this. I would like to stay here and hear more ideas and their passion. Thank you so much, David and Rick and Kat and Becky. I really appreciate your input and expertise and passion today. And I also want to thank you, our technical moderator, Walker Perry, who helped us to navigate through this. And of course, I want to thank you all attendees, and I hope you enjoy the presentation, enjoy hearing these ideas and concepts. And please go back to main event and go to the next session and enjoy the conference. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks,
we're right on time. 4:20.